July 18th, 390 BC. The morning sun beat down on the dusty plains north of Rome, where roughly 15,000 Roman citizens stood in formation, many holding weapons for the first time in their lives. They were farmers, merchants, craftsmen, hastily assembled into what Rome called an army. Across the field, perhaps 30,000 Gallic warriors waited, their long hair bleached with lime, their bodies covered in intricate tattoos and war paint, their voices rising in an otherworldly battle cry that made the Roman lines tremble. What happened in the next few hours would haunt Rome for centuries, a defeat so catastrophic that the Romans would date events as happening before or after the Gallic sack, a trauma so deep that Roman mothers would frighten children with tales of the barbarians from the north for generations. The Battle of the Allia wasn't just a military defeat, it was the moment Rome discovered it was not invincible, that the city that would one day rule the Mediterranean was, in 390 BC, just another Italian settlement vulnerable to destruction. The Gauls didn't just defeat Rome, they humiliated it, occupied it, and forced the Romans to buy back their own city with gold. But from this disaster came lessons that would transform Roman military thinking forever, lessons written in blood and shame that would eventually make Rome's legions the most feared fighting force in the ancient world. To understand how Rome found itself facing annihilation at the Allia, we need to understand who the Gauls were and why they had come to Italy. The Gauls, or Celts as they're often called, were not a unified nation but a collection of tribes sharing similar language, culture and religion, spread across what is now France, Belgium, parts of Spain, Britain and extending into Central Europe. Around 400 BC, Gallic tribes began migrating south across the Alps into the Po River Valley in northern Italy, a region the Romans would later call Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul on this side of the Alps. These weren't primitive savages, as Roman propaganda would later claim. The Gauls were skilled metalworkers who produced iron weapons superior to many Mediterranean peoples. They were experienced warriors who had been fighting each other and neighbouring tribes for generations. Their society was complex, with a ruling warrior aristocracy, a priestly class called Druids, and a sophisticated oral tradition that preserved their history and laws. They built fortified settlements called oppida, some covering hundreds of acres. They traded extensively with Greek colonies and Etruscan cities. They were formidable. The specific tribe that would destroy Rome's army and occupy its city was the Senones, led by a chieftain named Brennus. The ancient sources give us limited information about Brennus himself, but his name, which may have been a title rather than a personal name, means king or leader in Gaulish. The Senones had settled in the Adriatic coastal region of Italy, in what is now the Marcher region, and were looking to expand their territory and wealth through a combination of settlement, trade, and, when necessary, conquest. The spark that would ignite this disaster came from a city that most people today have never heard of, Clusium, an Etruscan settlement about 80 miles north of Rome. The Senones had besieged Clusium, and the desperate Etruscans did something that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. They appealed to Rome for help. Rome in 390 BC was not yet the master of Italy. It was one power among many, controlling perhaps 350 square miles of territory around the city itself. The Romans had been fighting their neighbours, other Latin cities, Etruscan settlements, the Volsci and Aequi tribes, for decades. They were tough, disciplined, and increasingly confident, but they were not yet dominant. The Roman Senate, in what seems to have been either spectacular arrogance or stunning ignorance of who they were dealing with, sent 3 ambassadors from the prestigious Fabii family to Clusium. Their mission was to negotiate, to convince the Gauls to leave the Etruscans alone. What happened next violated every principle of diplomatic immunity and sacred law. During negotiations, fighting broke out between the Gauls and Etruscans. The Roman ambassadors, Quintus Fabius, Caeso Fabius, and Numerius Fabius, didn't just observe. They joined the Etruscan side, and one of them, Quintus Fabius, killed a Gallic chieftain in single combat. The Gauls were outraged. Ambassadors were supposed to be sacrosanct, protected by divine law. The Romans had violated this ancient principle, and the Senones demanded justice. They sent envoys to Rome demanding that the Fabii be handed over for punishment. The Roman Senate, faced with a choice between honour and politics, chose politics. Not only did they refuse to punish the Fabii, but they elevated them to positions of military tribune with consular power, essentially making them generals. This decision, driven by the political influence of the powerful Fabius family, was catastrophic. Brennus and the Senones abandoned the siege of Clusium and marched directly toward Rome. The ancient sources describe the Gallic army as massive, perhaps 30,000 warriors, though these numbers are notoriously unreliable in ancient texts. What is clear is that the Gallic force significantly outnumbered anything Rome could field on short notice. The Romans, realizing they faced an existential threat, called up every able-bodied citizen. The standard Roman army of this period, organized into the phalanx formation borrowed from the Greeks, required extensive training to maintain the tight formation of overlapping shields and thrusting spears that made the phalanx effective. But there was no time for training. Farmers were handed spears and told to stand in line. Merchants were given shields they barely knew how to carry. Young men who had never seen combat were expected to hold formation against warriors who had been fighting since childhood. The Roman command structure was equally problematic. Rome in 390 BC was in a transitional period of government. They had expelled their last king over a century earlier and were still working out the details of republican government. Military command was divided among several military tribunes with consular power, including the disgraced Fabii who had started this mess. There was no unified command, no clear chain of authority, no single strategic vision. It was a recipe for disaster. The armies met at the Allia River, a small tributary of the Tiber about 11 miles north of Rome. The exact location has been debated by historians and archaeologists for centuries, but the general area is clear. It was relatively open ground, with the river providing what the Romans hoped would be a defensive advantage. The Roman commanders, whoever was actually in charge that day, deployed their army in what they thought was a strong defensive position. The main force of heavy infantry formed the traditional phalanx in the centre, shields locked, spears projecting forward. The right flank was anchored on the Allia River itself, which they believed would prevent the Gauls from outflanking them. The left flank was placed on elevated ground, a hill that overlooked the battlefield, with lighter armed troops and reserves positioned there to prevent the Gauls from seizing the high ground and attacking downhill into the Roman formation. It was, on paper, a reasonable deployment. The centre was strong, the flanks were protected by terrain. What the Romans failed to understand was that they weren't facing a Greek phalanx that would politely engage them head-on. They were facing Gallic warriors whose entire approach to warfare was fundamentally different from anything Rome had experienced. The Gallic army approached with characteristic noise and spectacle. Ancient sources describe the terrifying impression the Gauls made. They were generally taller than the Mediterranean peoples, with many warriors standing well over 6 feet. Their hair was bleached white or red with lime paste and worn long, swept back dramatically or spiked up. Many wore little armour, fighting bare-chested or in simple tunics to display their strength and fearlessness. Those who could afford it wore chainmail, an invention of the Celts that the Romans would later adopt. Their shields were large, oval and brightly decorated. Their primary weapons were long iron swords, designed for slashing rather than the thrusting attacks favoured by Mediterranean armies, and heavy spears. But the most terrifying aspect was the noise. The Gauls advanced while blowing carnix, long bronze war horns shaped like animal heads that produced an otherworldly, terrifying sound. Warriors beat their swords against their shields in rhythm, creating a thunderous percussion. They chanted war songs, shouted insults and challenges, worked themselves into a psychological state that Romans later interpreted as berserker rage, but was probably a calculated combination of religious ritual, psychological preparation, and intimidation tactics. For Roman farmers who had never seen combat, the sight and sound must have been absolutely terrifying. The battle began with what should have been a Roman advantage. The Gallic army advanced across the plain toward the Roman centre. If the Romans had maintained formation, if the phalanx had held, they might have had a chance. The phalanx, when properly maintained, was nearly impenetrable from the front, but Brennus had no intention of attacking the Roman strength. He had observed the Roman deployment and immediately identified its fatal weakness. The Roman left flank, positioned on the hill with lighter troops and reserves, was isolated from the main body. If the Gauls could seize that high ground, they could roll up the entire Roman line from the flank and rear. Brennus directed a massive force of his best warriors, perhaps 10,000 men, in a rapid assault directly at the Roman left. The Gauls didn't slowly advance in formation like a phalanx. They charged, running uphill with shocking speed and ferocity. The Roman troops on the hill, many of them poorly trained and lightly armed, had perhaps seconds to react. They were already psychologically shaken by the sight and sound of the Gallic army. Now they faced thousands of screaming warriors charging directly at them with apparent disregard for their own safety. The Roman left collapsed almost immediately. Some historians describe it as panic, others as a rational recognition that their position was untenable. Whatever the reason, the troops on the hill broke and ran without engaging in serious combat. This instant collapse of the flank had cascading consequences. The main Roman phalanx in the centre, hearing the chaos behind and to their left, turned to see what was happening. In a phalanx, discipline is everything. The moment soldiers look away, the moment the formation loosens, it becomes vulnerable. The Gauls, seeing the Roman line beginning to dissolve, launched their main attack. What happened next was a massacre. The Gallic warriors crashed into the Roman line with overwhelming force. The long Gallic swords, swung in wide arcs, were devastating against the tightly packed Roman formation. Roman soldiers, many of whom had never been in combat, had trained for an orderly pushing match between phalanxes, not this chaotic, brutal melee. The psychological shock was total. Within minutes, the Roman formation disintegrated completely. It wasn't an orderly retreat, it was a rout. Thousands of Roman soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The Gauls pursued with the efficiency of experienced warriors who knew that most casualties in ancient warfare occurred during the pursuit, not the battle itself. Roman soldiers fled in every direction. Some ran toward the Tiber River, hoping to cross to safety. Many drowned, weighed down by armour, exhausted from panic and exertion, unable to swim in the current. Others ran toward Rome, hoping to reach the city walls before the Gauls caught them. Many were cut down from behind as they fled. A small group of Roman soldiers, perhaps 1,000 or 2,000, managed to stay together and fought their way to the Etruscan city of Veii, about 10 miles northwest of Rome. Rome had conquered Veii just 6 years earlier in 396 BC after a brutal 10-year siege, and the city was largely abandoned. This group would survive to play a crucial role in what came next. The casualties were staggering. Ancient sources claim that nearly the entire Roman army was destroyed, with perhaps 10,000 Roman citizens killed or captured. Modern historians are skeptical of these exact numbers, but what's clear is that Rome's military power was effectively eliminated in a single afternoon. The military tribunes with consular power, who had commanded the army, including the Fabii who had started this disaster, were dead or fled. Rome's trained soldiers, its experienced centurions, its military leadership, gone. News of the disaster reached Rome ahead of the fleeing survivors. The city descended into chaos. There was no army to defend the walls. There was no time to organize a defense. The populace faced a decision: stay and be slaughtered, or flee and hope to survive. Most of the civilian population, women, children, elderly, non-combatants, fled south to neighbouring Latin cities, carrying whatever possessions they could. Caere, an Etruscan city about 30 miles northwest that had maintained good relations with Rome, provided refuge for many Roman citizens and, crucially, for the Vestal virgins who carried Rome's sacred religious objects. The preservation of these sacred items, including the eternal flame of Vesta and the Penates, the household gods of Rome, would prove symbolically important for Rome's survival and recovery. But not everyone fled. A group of Roman senators and patricians, the oldest and most distinguished citizens, made a decision that would echo through Roman history. They would stay in Rome and die with dignity rather than flee. According to tradition, these elderly patricians dressed in their finest robes, the regalia of their offices and priesthoods, and sat in chairs in the forum, waiting for the Gauls to arrive. Meanwhile, a force of fighting age men, perhaps 1,000 soldiers and armed citizens, withdrew to the Capitoline Hill, the most defensible of Rome's 7 hills, which was crowned by the Temple of Jupiter. They barricaded themselves in, took what supplies they could gather, and prepared to hold out as long as possible. The Gauls entered Rome the day after the battle. Ancient sources describe an eerie scene. The city was largely empty, doors open, possessions scattered in the streets where people had dropped them in flight. The Gauls moved cautiously at first, suspicious of a trap. How could a city this large be so easily abandoned? Where was the ambush? They found the elderly patricians sitting in the forum in their ceremonial dress, so still that some Gauls initially thought they were statues. According to Livy's account, one Gaul approached Marcus Papirius, a former consul and high priest, and stroked his long beard out of curiosity or mockery. Papirius struck the Gaul across the face with his ivory staff of office. The Gaul killed him immediately, and the slaughter of the remaining patricians began. This story may be legend rather than history, but it reflects Roman ideals of dignitas, of maintaining dignity even in death, that would define Roman culture for centuries. The Gauls proceeded to loot and burn the city. Most of Rome was not built of stone in 390 BC, but of wood and mud brick. Fires spread easily. The Gauls systematically destroyed what they couldn't carry off. Temples were looted of their treasures. Houses were ransacked. What the Gauls couldn't use, they destroyed. Only the Capitoline Hill, where the Roman defenders had barricaded themselves, remained untaken. The Gauls besieged it, but the hill's steep slopes and the desperation of the defenders made direct assault too costly. The siege of the Capitoline lasted for months. Ancient sources claim 7 months, though modern historians think 3 to 4 months is more likely. During this time, both sides suffered terribly. The Romans on the Capitoline were starving, reduced to eating leather and whatever could be found. Disease was rampant. The Gauls, camped in the ruins of Rome, were also suffering. They were warriors, not besiegers. They had no experience with long sieges and no infrastructure to support one. More critically, disease began ravaging their camp. Living in the ruins of a destroyed city, probably with poor sanitation and contaminated water supplies, the Gauls started dying of pestilence in large numbers. It was during this siege that one of Rome's most famous legends occurred. According to tradition, the Gauls attempted a night assault on the Capitoline, climbing the steep slopes in darkness. The Roman sentries had fallen asleep, exhausted from hunger and constant watch. The guard dogs were too weak from starvation to bark. But the sacred geese of Juno, kept in the temple, heard the Gauls and began honking loudly, waking Marcus Manlius, a former consul. Manlius rallied the defenders and threw back the assault. Whether or not this story is literally true, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, Manlius of the Capitoline, became a genuine Roman hero, though his story would end tragically later when political rivalries led to his execution. The geese of Juno were honoured in Rome for centuries afterward. As the siege dragged on, both sides realised they needed a resolution. The Gauls were dying of disease and were also concerned about other Gallic tribes in northern Italy hearing of their success and potentially threatening their home territories in their absence. The Romans were starving and facing inevitable defeat if the siege continued. Negotiations began. The Roman commander on the Capitoline was Marcus Furius Camillus, who had previously been exiled from Rome due to political disputes, a common occurrence in the brutal politics of the early Republic. Camillus had been recalled during the crisis and given dictatorial powers, a constitutional emergency measure where all power was temporarily concentrated in one person, for no more than 6 months to deal with an existential threat. The terms of the negotiation were humiliating. Rome would pay £1,000 of gold to the Gauls to leave. That this amount of gold could even be gathered shows that not all of Rome's wealth had been destroyed, that some had been hidden or removed before the Gauls arrived. But when the gold was weighed, using the Gallic scales and weights, the Romans protested that the scales were rigged, that the Gauls were cheating. Brennus's response became one of history's most famous phrases. He threw his sword onto the scales, adding its weight to the required tribute, and declared, "Vae victis, woe to the conquered." The message was clear. You lost. You pay whatever we demand. You have no rights, no recourse, no dignity. Justice belongs to the victors. This moment, whether it happened exactly as described or is literary invention by later Roman historians, defined Rome's relationship with the Gallic threat for centuries. The shame of paying tribute, of buying back their own city, of being at the mercy of barbarians, burned into Roman consciousness. But different sources give different endings to this story. In the most satisfying version, Camillus arrived with the army he had been gathering from Roman refugees and survivors, declared that Rome would not be ransomed but freed by iron, not gold, and defeated the Gauls in battle, recovering the gold and Roman honour. Most modern historians think this version is wishful thinking, propaganda written long after the events. The Gauls probably took their gold and left, satisfied with their plunder and weakened by disease. What is certain is that the Gauls left Rome in ruins. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread burning and destruction in Rome dating to this period. The city that had been growing in size and influence was reduced to rubble. But Rome survived, and the lessons learned from this disaster would transform it into something far more formidable. The first lesson was military. The Roman phalanx, borrowed from the Greeks, had proven inadequate. It required extensive training, it was inflexible, and it was vulnerable to flanking attacks by more mobile forces. Over the following decades, Rome would develop the manipular legion, a revolutionary military system that divided the army into smaller, more flexible units, called maniples that could operate independently. This system allowed Roman armies to adapt to terrain, to respond to flanking attacks, to maintain cohesion even when parts of the line were engaged. It was faster to train, more forgiving of inexperienced soldiers, and far more effective against various enemies. The manipular legion, refined over decades, would become the most effective military system in the Mediterranean world. The second lesson was strategic. Rome realized it could not rely on allies or hope that threats would pass by. It needed to control the territory around it, to create buffer zones, to eliminate threats before they reached the city. This realization led to the Roman conquest of Italy. Over the next century, Rome systematically conquered or allied with every city and tribe in Italy, creating a system where Rome's security was guaranteed by controlling everyone around it. The ruthlessness and thoroughness of this conquest were directly related to the trauma of the Gallic sack. Never again would an enemy army march unmolested to Rome's gates. The third lesson was about fortification. Rome had been partially walled before 390 BC, but the defences were inadequate. In the decades following the Gallic sack, Rome constructed the Servian Wall, named after the legendary king Servius Tullius, though actually built much later. These massive fortifications, some sections still visible in modern Rome, were 10 metres high, 4 metres thick, and encompassed all 7 hills of Rome, creating a 7-mile perimeter. They represented an enormous investment of labour and resources, but Rome was determined never to be caught defenceless again. The fourth lesson was psychological. The Gallic sack taught Rome that victory was not guaranteed, that overconfidence was deadly, that enemies who looked primitive could be lethal. This created a Roman military culture that emphasized discipline, training, preparation, and above all, never underestimating an enemy. The Romans would face the Gauls again many times over the next centuries. Every time the Romans remembered the Allia, remembered the shame of paying tribute, remembered their burned city. This memory drove Roman determination to defeat and dominate the Gallic tribes completely. The impact on Roman religion and culture was profound. The Romans became obsessed with divine favour and religious propriety. They believed that the disaster at the Allia had been caused by the gods punishing Rome for the Fabi's violation of diplomatic immunity. This conviction, that maintaining proper religious observances was essential to Roman success, became central to Roman identity. The date of the battle, July 18th, was declared a dies nefastus, an unlucky day when no public business could be conducted. The Romans carefully noted every omen, every portent, every sign of divine displeasure, and took elaborate steps to maintain the Pax Deorum, peace with the gods. The Gallic threat remained real for Rome for centuries. In 367 BC, just 23 years after the sack, Gauls raided south again and were barely turned back. In 361 BC, another Gallic invasion was defeated by Titus Manlius Torquatus, who earned his cognomen Torquatus, the man with the torque, by killing a giant Gallic champion in single combat and taking his golden neck torque as a trophy. In 349 BC, Gauls invaded again and were defeated by Marcus Valerius Corvus, whose cognomen Corvus, the Raven, came from a legend that a raven assisted him in single combat against a Gallic warrior. These repeated invasions kept the memory of 390 BC fresh. The Gauls remained Rome's nightmare enemy, unpredictable, fierce, numerous. When Gauls under Brennus, possibly a descendant or successor using the same title, invaded Greece and attacked Delphi in 279 BC, the Greeks asked Rome for help, and Rome, remembering its own disaster, sent a force to assist. When Gauls settled in Asia Minor, creating Galatia, Romans took note. When Hannibal invaded Italy in 218 BC during the Second Punic War, he brought Gallic allies with him, and the Romans fought with extra ferocity against these traditional enemies. The final reckoning with the Gauls came in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, when Rome systematically conquered all Gallic territories. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul from 58 to 50 BC was not just about expanding Roman territory or Caesar's personal ambition. It was about eliminating forever the threat that had burned Rome 340 years earlier. When Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Gallic War, he was writing for an audience that remembered the stories their ancestors had passed down about the terror of the Gauls. His victories were not just military successes, but the final act in a drama that began at the Allia River. The historical significance of the Battle of the Allia extends beyond the immediate disaster. This single defeat, this afternoon of panic and slaughter on the banks of a minor river, fundamentally changed Roman military thinking, Roman strategic culture, and Roman national psychology. The Romans who rebuilt their city after 390 BC were different from the Romans who had marched confidently to meet the Gauls. They were harder, more realistic, more determined, more professional in their approach to warfare. They understood that wars were won not by courage alone, but by training, discipline, organisation, and the willingness to learn from defeat. The Roman response to the Gallic sack demonstrated characteristics that would define Roman success for centuries. They didn't give up, they didn't abandon Rome, they didn't accept defeat as final. They rebuilt, they reformed, they learned, and they returned stronger. The Manipular legion that grew out of lessons learned at the Allia would defeat Pyrrhus of Epirus, Hannibal's Carthaginians, the Macedonian phalanx, and eventually every enemy Rome faced. The strategic vision of controlling Italy to prevent future invasions would lead to Roman dominance of the Mediterranean. The discipline and determination forged in the shame of defeat would carry Rome from a regional power to an empire spanning 3 continents. Modern military historians recognize the Battle of the Allia as a classic example of how tactical inflexibility and poor command structure can lead to disaster, regardless of courage or motivation. The Roman deployment, with its isolated left flank, violated basic military principles. The divided command structure meant no one could adapt to changing circumstances. The lack of training meant the army couldn't maintain cohesion under pressure. These were mistakes Rome never repeated. The Roman military system that evolved in the following centuries was characterized by clarity of command, tactical flexibility, extensive training, and careful attention to all aspects of warfare from logistics to medical care to engineering. The Gallic sack also influenced Roman attitudes towards citizenship and military service. The Romans realized that their survival depended on having a large pool of trained soldiers. They developed a system where citizenship was tied to military service, where serving in the legions was both a duty and a path to social advancement. The Roman citizen soldier, trained, disciplined, loyal, became the backbone of Roman power. This was a direct response to the disaster at the Allia, where untrained civilians thrown into formation had broken and run at the first real test. Archaeological evidence from Rome shows the extent of the destruction in 390 BC and the rapid rebuilding that followed. Layers of ash and destruction debris date to this period, confirming the ancient accounts of burning and devastation. But immediately above these destruction layers, evidence of rebuilding appears. New foundations, new construction, organized and planned, showing that Rome recovered quickly from the physical destruction even as the psychological scars remained. The Servian wall, portions of which survive, was built with massive blocks of volcanic tuff, some weighing several tons, fitted together with such precision that mortar wasn't needed. The scale and sophistication of this fortification project, undertaken by a city that had just been destroyed, shows Roman determination and organizational capacity. The political impact within Rome was also significant. The Fabii family, whose members had violated diplomatic immunity and helped precipitate the disaster, lost their political dominance for a generation. Families like the Furi and Valeri, whose members distinguished themselves in the recovery, rose to prominence. The position of dictator, which had been controversial, was validated by Camillus's successful leadership during the crisis. The relationship between patricians and plebeians, always a source of tension in the early Republic, was temporarily improved as both classes worked together to rebuild Rome and defend against future threats. The story of the Gallic sack was kept alive in Roman culture for centuries. Every Roman schoolboy learned about the disaster at the Allia, the burning of Rome, the geese of Juno, and the shame of Vae Victis. These stories weren't just history lessons, but moral instruction about the importance of maintaining proper religious observances, the dangers of arrogance, the value of courage in the face of disaster, and the imperative of learning from defeat. Roman historians, from Livy to Plutarch, return to this story again and again, each time drawing lessons relevant to their own era. When we look at the long arc of Roman history, from the disaster at the Allia in 390 BC to the height of imperial power, 500 years later, we can trace a direct line of development. The military reforms that followed the Gallic sack led to the Manipular Legion. The Manipular Legion evolved into the cohort-based legions of the late Republic and Empire. The strategic principle of controlling potential threats through conquest or alliance led to Roman dominance of Italy, then the Mediterranean, then beyond. The trauma of seeing their city occupied and burned created a Roman determination that borders on obsession, that this must never happen again. For 800 years, no foreign enemy would occupy Rome. The next time a barbarian army would sack Rome would be in 410 AD, when Alaric and the Visigoths breached the walls, and by then Rome's power was already fading. The Battle of the Allia and its aftermath also teaches us about how societies respond to catastrophic defeat. Rome could have collapsed, could have been permanently destroyed, could have been absorbed by other powers. Many cities and peoples in the ancient world disappeared after similar disasters, but Rome survived because its citizens chose to survive, chose to rebuild, chose to learn from their mistakes rather than repeat them. The physical destruction was repaired within years. The military system was reformed within decades. The strategic vulnerability was eliminated within a century. But the memory, the shame, the determination to never again be so vulnerable, that lasted for as long as Rome itself. The Gauls, for their part, remained a significant power in Europe for centuries. They continued to raid into Italy periodically, until Roman conquests in the 2nd century BC secured northern Italy. They fought against Roman expansion into southern France, and eventually into Gaul itself. They provided some of history's most dramatic moments, from the siege of Rome to the invasion of Greece, to their service as mercenaries across the Mediterranean world. But they never developed the organizational structures, the strategic vision, or the institutional memory that characterized Roman military culture. They remained formidable warriors individually and in tribal groups, but they never created anything approaching Roman military system with its training, logistics, engineering, and strategic planning. The contrast between Gallic and Roman military culture, visible at the Allia, only grew more pronounced over time. The Gauls won at the Allia through warrior spirit, tactical awareness from Brennus, and overwhelming assault. The Romans lost through poor preparation, divided command, and inadequate training. But the Romans learned from this defeat in ways that the Gauls, lacking institutional structures to preserve and transmit lessons, never did. When Caesar conquered Gaul 340 years after the Allia, he faced warriors who fought much as their ancestors had at the Allia, individually brave, fierce in assault, but lacking the discipline, training, and organization that by then characterized Roman legions. The Gallic warrior was essentially unchanged from 390 BC to 50 BC. The Roman soldier of 50 BC bore almost no resemblance to the panicked farmer who threw down his spear and ran at the Allia. This perhaps is the ultimate lesson of the Battle of the Allia, that defeat can be a better teacher than victory, that disaster can catalyze transformation in ways that success never does, and that the response to catastrophe matters more than the catastrophe itself. Rome was destroyed in 390 BC, but from that destruction came a reformed military system, a strategic vision, and a national determination that would eventually make Rome master of the known world. The Gauls won the battle, sacked the city, and extracted their tribute. But Rome won the war, the long war that lasted centuries and ended with Roman victory so complete that Gaul became one of the most thoroughly Romanized regions of the empire. Today, the exact location of the Battle of the Allia is uncertain, somewhere along the small river north of Rome, now surrounded by modern development and agriculture. There is no monument, no marker, nothing to indicate that here, on this ground, Rome suffered its greatest early defeat. But the battle's legacy is everywhere in Rome itself, in the Servian wall whose massive blocks still stand in places, in the Roman military system that evolved in response to this disaster, in the Roman strategic culture that never forgot the lesson that threats must be eliminated before they reach your gates, and in the Roman determination visible throughout their history that defeat was never final, only a lesson to be learned on the path to eventual victory. The men who died at the Allia, the soldiers who drowned in the Tiber, the patricians who sat in dignity waiting for death, the defenders who starved on the Capitoline, they did not die in vain. Their sacrifice, though born of poor preparation and worse command, taught Rome lessons that would echo through centuries. When Roman legions marched in perfect formation, when Roman engineers built fortifications that defied siege, when Roman strategy eliminated threats before they became existential, when Roman determination turned defeat into eventual victory, they were honouring the memory of that terrible day by the Allia River, when Rome learned it was not invincible and determined to become so. The transformation of Rome's military system after the Gallic sack was not immediate or simple. It took decades of experimentation, further defeats, and gradual refinement to develop the manipular legion that would eventually dominate Mediterranean warfare. The Roman commanders who survived the Allia and the Younger generation that followed them understood that the phalanx formation, for all its theoretical strengths, had failed catastrophically against an enemy that refused to fight on its terms. The phalanx required soldiers to stand shoulder to shoulder in ranks perhaps 8 or 12 deep, each man protected by his shield and those of his neighbours, thrusting with short spears over the shield wall. It was devastatingly effective against another phalanx in open terrain. But it required extensive training to maintain formation. It couldn't adapt to rough terrain. It was vulnerable to flanking attacks, and as the Allia had demonstrated, if part of the formation broke, the entire line could collapse like dominoes. The manipular system that emerged represented a radical departure from Mediterranean military thinking. Instead of one massive formation, the Roman army was divided into maniples, units of 120 men for hastati and principes, 60 men for triarii, arranged in a checkerboard pattern with gaps between units. This seemed counterintuitive, leaving holes in the line that an enemy could exploit. But the gaps allowed maniples to move independently, to adapt to terrain, to support each other, and to rotate fresh troops to the front while exhausted units fell back to rest. A Roman army in the manipular formation was like a living organism, constantly adapting, shifting, responding to threats from any direction. If one maniple was pressed hard, the units behind could move forward to support it. If the enemy tried to exploit the gaps, the maniples could close ranks, or the units behind would engage them. If terrain broke up the formation, each maniple could fight independently until order was restored. This system required a different kind of soldier than the phalanx. The Roman legionary needed to fight effectively in his small unit, to maintain spacing with his fellows rather than pressing shield to shield, to use his weapons in a more open style of combat. The Roman gladius, the short sword that became Rome's signature weapon, was perfect for this style of fighting. Unlike the long slashing swords of the Gauls or the thrusting spears of the phalanx, the gladius was designed for close combat, for stabbing attacks that could be delivered in the confined space of a dense formation. A Roman soldier didn't need room to wind up for a big slash. He could deliver killing thrust from behind his shield with minimal movement. The scutum, the large rectangular shield that replaced earlier circular shields, provided excellent protection while allowing the soldier to maintain visual contact with his unit and respond to commands. The training system also evolved. Roman soldiers drilled constantly, practicing movements, formations, weapons handling, until responses became automatic. They practiced building fortified camps every night on campaign, digging ditches and raising ramparts with such efficiency that a Roman army on the march was never vulnerable to surprise attack. They practiced forced marches covering 20 miles in 5 hours while carrying 60 pounds of equipment. They practiced construction, learning to build bridges, siege engines, and fortifications. A Roman legion became not just a fighting force but a military machine capable of engineering logistics and sustained operations far from home. This professionalization was a direct response to the amateur army that had panicked at the Allia. The command structure was also reformed. While political considerations still determined who commanded Roman armies, with consuls and praetors leading legions as part of their political offices, a professional class of centurions emerged as the backbone of Roman military leadership. Centurions, commanding units of about 80 men in the later system, were professional soldiers promoted from the ranks based on merit, experience, and demonstrated leadership. They maintained discipline, executed tactics, and ensured that the sophisticated Roman military system actually functioned in combat. When noble-born commanders made strategic decisions, centurions made those decisions reality on the battlefield. This combination of political leadership for strategy and professional leadership for tactics gave Rome flexibility that few ancient armies possessed. The first major test of Rome's reformed military system came not against the Gauls, but against the Samnites, a tough mountain people who controlled much of central and southern Italy. The Samnite Wars, spanning three major conflicts from 343 to 290 BC, forced Rome to perfect its new military approach. The Samnites were formidable opponents who used terrain expertly, favoured ambush and guerrilla tactics, and fought with desperate intensity to maintain their independence. In 321 BC, they inflicted a humiliating defeat on Rome at the Caudine Forks, trapping two Roman armies in a mountain pass and forcing them to surrender without a fight. The Roman soldiers were made to pass under a yoke of spears, symbolising their subjugation, a humiliation that recalled the shame of the Gallic tribute. But Rome's response to the Caudine Forks demonstrated how much had changed since the Allia. After the Gallic disaster, Rome had been paralysed, nearly destroyed. After the Caudine Forks, Rome repudiated the surrender treaty, raised new armies, and returned to the war with even greater determination. The Romans adapted their tactics to mountain warfare, learning to fight in rough terrain where traditional formations couldn't function. They built military roads, the famous Roman roads that would eventually span their empire, to move troops quickly through difficult country. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC during the Samnite Wars, allowed Roman armies to bypass difficult terrain and maintain supply lines into enemy territory. The Romans were learning that victory required not just better soldiers, but better infrastructure, better logistics, better strategic planning. The Samnite Wars also saw Rome begin to develop its system of alliances and colonies that would eventually unite Italy. Rather than simply conquering and occupying territory, Rome established colonies of Roman citizens in strategic locations, built networks of allied cities who maintained autonomy in exchange for military support, and gradually created a system where Rome's security was guaranteed by a web of alliances and colonies throughout Italy. This was strategic thinking on a different level from anything seen at the Allia, where Rome had marched out with one army expecting a single battle to resolve the crisis. The new Roman approach recognized that security required systematic control of territory, reliable allies, and the ability to mobilize resources across a wide area. By 290 BC, when the Third Samnite War ended with Roman victory, Rome controlled most of central Italy and was emerging as the dominant power in the peninsula. The military system refined in these wars, the manipular legion supported by allied troops, road networks enabling rapid movement, colonies securing conquered territory, would prove devastatingly effective against every enemy Rome faced. When Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of antiquity's most successful generals and a distant relative of Alexander the Great, invaded Italy in 280 BC to support the Greek cities of southern Italy against Roman expansion, he brought the Macedonian phalanx, the military system that had conquered the Persian Empire and was considered invincible. Pyrrhus won his first two battles against Rome, at Heraclea in 280 BC and Osculum in 279 BC, but both were Pyrrhic victories, costing him casualties he couldn't replace. At Osculum, Pyrrhus reportedly said, "Another such victory and I shall be ruined," giving us the term Pyrrhic victory for a success that costs more than it gains. What Pyrrhus discovered was that the Roman military system was fundamentally different from anything he had faced. The Macedonian phalanx could defeat a Roman formation in a single engagement, but the Romans had depth, resources and determination that outlasted tactical brilliance. When Pyrrhus won a battle, he couldn't replace his losses. When Rome lost, new legions appeared as if from nowhere, fresh troops raised from Rome's growing network of citizens and allies. The final battle between Pyrrhus and Rome came at Beneventum in 275 BC. By this point, the Romans had learned how to fight the phalanx, using their superior flexibility to attack the flanks, using light troops to harass the formation, using terrain to break up the solid mass of pikes. The Manipular legion proved superior to the phalanx in every way except in direct frontal collision between heavy infantry, and the Romans simply refused to fight on those terms. They manoeuvred, harassed, divided, and eventually defeated Pyrrhus's army. The king withdrew from Italy, remarking that he left Rome and Carthage, the two rising powers of the Western Mediterranean, to fight over his corpse, an eerily prophetic statement given the Punic Wars that would follow. Rome's victory over Pyrrhus, one of the era's greatest generals commanding what was considered the era's best military system, validated everything Rome had learned and built since the Allia. The military reforms, the strategic vision, the training and professionalization, the logistics and infrastructure, the determination and resilience, all proved superior to tactical genius and individual prowess. By 270 BC, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River. The transformation from regional power that had been destroyed by Gallic raiders to master of Italy had taken 120 years, exactly the span from the Gallic sack in 390 BC to the completion of the Italian conquest around 270 BC. But even as Rome consolidated control of Italy, the Gallic threat remained. The Gauls in northern Italy, in the region that would become Cisalpine Gaul, watched Rome's expansion with alarm. In 225 BC, a massive Gallic coalition invaded Italy, reportedly fielding 70,000 warriors in what Romans called the Gallic War. The invasion was the largest Gallic threat since 390 BC, and it triggered Roman memories of that ancient disaster. But the Rome of 225 BC was not the Rome of 390 BC. The Romans mobilized overwhelming force, raising multiple armies, and met the Gauls at Telamon on the coast of Etruria. The Battle of Telamon demonstrated Roman military superiority in every dimension. The Gauls were trapped between two Roman armies, attacked from front and rear, and systematically destroyed. Roman sources claim 40,000 Gauls killed and 10,000 captured. Even accounting for ancient exaggeration, it was a devastating defeat. Following Telamon, Rome launched a systematic conquest of northern Italy, the homeland of the Gallic tribes that had threatened Rome for over 150 years. The campaigns from 225 to 220 BC were brutal, characterized by Roman ruthlessness born from centuries of fear and resentment of the Gauls. Roman armies swept through the Po Valley, defeating tribes, establishing colonies, confiscating land, and bringing the entire region under Roman control. The foundation of colonies like Cremona and Placentia, settled with Roman citizens, permanently altered the ethnic and cultural landscape of northern Italy. The Gauls were not exterminated but were subordinated, Romanized, and eventually absorbed into the Roman system. When Hannibal invaded Italy in 218 BC at the start of the Second Punic War, he recruited heavily from the Gallic tribes of northern Italy, who saw Carthaginian invasion as an opportunity to throw off Roman rule. Thousands of Gauls joined Hannibal's army, providing much-needed manpower to replace losses from the Alpine crossing. At Trebia, Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae, Gallic warriors fought alongside Carthaginian troops to inflict terrible defeats on Rome. Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal's army killed perhaps 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon, was the worst military disaster in Roman history, far exceeding even the Allia in scale of casualties. But Rome's response to Cannae demonstrated how completely Roman strategic culture had evolved since 390 BC. After the Allia, Rome had been paralysed, nearly destroyed, reduced to buying back its own city. After Cannae, having lost a significant portion of its military manpower in one day, Rome refused to negotiate, refused to surrender, and instead raised new armies. The Romans implemented a strategy of attrition, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal, while systematically recapturing his allies, maintaining multiple armies in the field simultaneously, and gradually wearing down Carthaginian resources. This required reserves of manpower, wealth, and determination that would have been unthinkable in 390 BC. The Romans mobilized everyone, arming slaves, releasing debtors from prison, lowering property qualifications for military service, and drawing on their network of Italian allies who, despite Hannibal's presence and Roman defeats, mostly remained loyal. This loyalty was the fruit of Rome's careful alliance system developed over the previous century. Rome didn't just conquer cities, it integrated them, gave them stakes in Roman success, treated Italian allies as partners rather than subjects. When the crisis came, most of them stood with Rome even when defeat seemed inevitable. The contrast with 390 BC, when Rome stood alone against the Gauls with no allies coming to its aid, could not be more stark. The Second Punic War also revealed how much Roman military capability had advanced. Hannibal, one of history's greatest tactical geniuses, won virtually every battle he fought on Italian soil, yet he couldn't defeat Rome. The Romans simply absorbed losses that would have destroyed any other state and kept fighting. They learned from Hannibal's tactics, adapted their strategies, and eventually produced generals like Scipio Africanus who could beat Hannibal at his own game. When Scipio invaded Africa and defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC, he used tactics that combined Roman discipline with Hannibalic maneuver, demonstrating that Rome had learned to match or exceed any enemy in tactical sophistication while maintaining superior resources and organization. The Gallic contingents in Hannibal's army, fighting with their traditional ferocity and courage, proved that individual Gallic warriors were still formidable, but they also demonstrated that warrior culture without institutional structures couldn't compete with professional military systems backed by state resources. When the war ended with Carthaginian defeat, the Gauls in northern Italy faced Roman retribution. The campaigns from 200 to 190 BC completed the pacification of Cisalpine Gaul, with Roman armies systematically crushing resistance and establishing permanent Roman control. By 180 BC, the Gallic threat to Italy was permanently eliminated, 210 years after the sack of Rome. But Gauls remained a significant presence across Europe, and Rome's expansion brought continued conflict. As Rome moved into southern France in the late 2nd century BC, establishing the province of Gallia Narbonensis, it came into conflict with Gallic tribes in Gaul proper. The migration of Germanic tribes, particularly the Cimbrian Teutoners, through Gallic territory in the late 2nd century BC threatened both Gauls and Romans. When these Germanic tribes defeated several Roman armies, killing as many as 80,000 Roman soldiers in various disasters from 113 to 105 BC, it triggered Roman memories of earlier barbarian invasions. The eventual Roman victories over the Cimbrian Teutones by Gaius Marius in 102 and 101 BC relied on continued refinements to Roman military organization, including the Marian reforms that professionalized the legions even further. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, from 58 to 50 BC, was the final chapter in the long conflict that had begun at the Allia River in 390 BC. Caesar faced a vast territory, numerous powerful tribes, and a population that may have numbered 10 million or more. The Gallic tribes were still formidable warriors, still capable of raising enormous armies, still dangerous. At Gergovia in 52 BC, the Gallic leader Vercingetorix defeated Caesar, inflicting significant casualties. But the overall campaign demonstrated the complete superiority of Roman military organization over tribal warfare. Caesar commanded an army that could build fortifications of astonishing complexity, as at Alesia, where the Romans built 2 complete rings of fortifications, one facing inward to besiege the Gallic stronghold, and one facing outward to defend against relieving forces. They could fight coordinated battles across hundreds of miles simultaneously. They could maintain supply lines across vast distances. They could adapt to any terrain or tactical situation. The Gauls, despite their numbers and courage, couldn't match this systematic approach to warfare. At Alesia in 52 BC, Vercingetorix commanded 80,000 warriors in the fortress and was supported by a relief force estimated at 250,000. Caesar's 60,000 legionaries were outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1 overall, yet through superior position, fortifications, discipline and tactical skill, they defeated both forces and ended Gallic resistance. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked the end of independent Gallic power and the completion of a process that had begun with the Roman military reforms following the Allia. The psychological dimensions of Rome's conflict with the Gauls cannot be overstated. For 340 years, from 390 to 50 BC, the memory of the Gallic sack haunted Roman consciousness. Every Roman knew the story, knew the shame, knew the determination never to repeat it. This wasn't abstract history, it was living memory passed down through families. Roman aristocratic families maintained death masks and family histories that preserved stories of ancestors who had lived through or died in the Gallic sack. The cognomina, the surnames of Roman families, often commemorated victories over Gauls. Torquatus from the captured Torque, Corvus from the legendary Raven, these names reminded Romans of battles against their ancient enemy. The religious dimensions were equally important. The Romans believed that the Gallic sack had been divine punishment for the Fabii's violation of diplomatic immunity. This conviction that proper religious observance was essential to Roman success became embedded in Roman culture. Before every major battle, Roman commanders performed elaborate sacrifices and consulted omens. The College of Augurs, priests who interpreted signs from the gods, wielded enormous influence. This wasn't superstition in the modern sense, but a systematic approach to reducing uncertainty and ensuring that every possible advantage, including divine favour, was secured before undertaking dangerous enterprises. The Romans who performed these rituals were the same pragmatic, practical people who built sophisticated siege engines and aqueducts. They saw no contradiction between religious piety and military efficiency. The political impact of the Gallic Wars on Roman development was profound. The military crisis of 390 BC had required Romans of all classes to cooperate for survival. The plebeians, Rome's lower-class citizens, had provided most of the soldiers who died at the Allia, and most of the fighters who defended the Capitoline. In the decades following, they demanded and gradually won political rights that had previously been reserved for patricians. The conflict of the orders, the long struggle between patrician and plebeian for political equality, was accelerated by the shared trauma and shared effort of surviving the Gallic threat. By the early 3rd century BC, plebeians had won the right to hold the consulship, Rome's highest office, and the class distinction, while never entirely erased, became less rigid. This internal political evolution, driven partly by the crisis of 390 BC, made Rome stronger by allowing talent from all classes to contribute to leadership. The broader strategic lessons Rome learned from the Allia and its aftermath went beyond purely military reforms. The Romans understood that security required multiple layers of defence: strong fortifications around Rome itself, control of the surrounding territory through alliances and colonies, military roads enabling rapid response to threats, a professional army capable of sustained campaigns, and resources sufficient to replace losses and continue fighting even after defeats. This comprehensive approach to security, born from the disaster of 390 BC, became the foundation of Roman imperial strategy. When Rome eventually controlled an empire spanning from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, it secured that vast territory using principles developed in the decades after the Gallic sack. The influence of the Gallic sack on Roman identity persisted long after the military threat was eliminated. Roman literature returned to the story constantly. Livy, writing his monumental History of Rome during the reign of Augustus around 10 AD, 380 years after the events, devoted considerable space to the Gallic sack, treating it as one of the defining moments in Roman history. Plutarch, writing a century later, included the story in his Lives, emphasizing the moral and character lessons. For Romans throughout their history, the Gallic sack represented both a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and unpreparedness, and an inspirational story about resilience, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat as final. The memory of 390 BC also influenced Roman attitudes toward other barbarian peoples. When Romans encountered Germans, Dacians, Britons, or other northern peoples, they filtered these experiences through their historical memory of the Gauls. The Romans recognized that these tribal peoples, while lacking Roman organization and technology, could be dangerous, numerous, and should never be underestimated. This produced a Roman approach to barbarian frontiers that combined military strength, fortifications, diplomacy, and the willingness to launch preemptive campaigns to eliminate threats before they could materialize. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the Rhine and Danube frontier fortifications, the system of buffer states and client kings, all reflected strategic thinking rooted in the lesson of the Allia that threats must be controlled before they reach your heartland. The final irony of the Battle of the Allia and the Gallic sack is that this catastrophic defeat ultimately made Rome stronger. The military reforms, strategic vision, political evolution, and psychological determination that emerged from this disaster were essential to Rome's eventual success. A Rome that had never faced the Gauls, never experienced the humiliation of occupation, never learned the hard lessons of the Allia, might have remained a regional Italian power, confident in its traditional ways, unprepared for the larger challenges to come. The Gallic sack forced Rome to evolve, to think strategically, to professionalize its military, to develop the systems and attitudes that would eventually enable it to dominate the Mediterranean world. When Roman legions marched to conquer Gaul in the 1st century BC, they were the heirs of the soldiers who had died at the Allia. The shame of that defeat, kept alive for 340 years, motivated Roman determination to dominate the Gallic peoples completely. When Vercingetorix surrendered at Alesia, when Gallic territory became Roman provinces, when Gallic warriors eventually served in Roman legions defending the empire, it marked the completion of a historical arc that began with panic and slaughter on the banks of the Allia River. The Romans had taken their worst defeat and transformed it into ultimate victory through centuries of determination, learning, adaptation, and refusal to accept that disaster was final. This may be the most important legacy of the Battle of the Allia, the demonstration that defeat can be the catalyst for transformation, that learning from failure can be more valuable than learning from success, and that resilience and determination can ultimately triumph over tactical brilliance and temporary victory. The Gauls won the battle, sacked the city, and extracted their tribute, but Rome won the war, the centuries-long struggle that ended with Rome, master of all Gaul, and the Gallic threat eliminated forever. The farmers who panicked at the Allia, the senators who died with dignity in the Forum, the defenders who starved on the Capitoline, they could not have imagined that their sacrifice and Rome's determination would ultimately lead to an empire that would dominate the known world for half a millennium. But that is exactly what happened, and it began with disaster on July 18th, through 90 BC, when the Gauls swarmed a Roman camp and Rome learned lessons that would echo through the ages.